There's a question I've never been able to answer, not in 30 years of working cattle and riding line across the Texas breaks. It isn't the kind of question a man asks out loud. Not around a fire, not in a saloon, not in church, though I've sat in enough of those pews trying to find something that felt like an answer. The question is this: when everything you were taught says one thing, and everything you've seen with your own eyes says another, which one do you let go of? I was 26 years old the summer I found out I didn't have an answer. I found out because of 3 sisters and a Comanche warrior named Satapo. I found out at the edge of a dry creek bed in the Texas Panhandle, in August heat that turned the air to something you had to chew before you could breathe it, while a man I'd been raised to fear showed me something I'd never once seen in a church, or a bunkhouse, or a courthouse, or anywhere else men congregate and call themselves civilized. He showed me what it looks like when someone chooses to be responsible for a life that has nothing to do with his own. I've written this down before, burned it twice, started over 3 times on the back of feed ledger pages because I kept running out of room and kept running out of nerve. This time I'm finishing it. This time I want you to know what I know. Not what the newspapers wrote, not what the army filed, not what the women themselves would later say in their careful, guarded way when journalists came calling. What I know. The first thing I heard was the chain. Not the wind, not the crows, not the creak of the wagon wheel that had split its rim 2 miles back and left me stranded on the caprock with nothing but a lame horse, and the particular kind of despair that comes from being utterly, profoundly alone in country that doesn't care whether you live or die. The chain. It had a sound unlike anything I'd heard before, not the bright jangle of trace chains or the low drag of logging iron. This sound was irregular, halting, like something trying to move and being refused. I keep a field log. Have since I was a boy, my mother's habit, passed down from her father who was a surveyor, and before him a cartographer who drew coastlines he'd never sailed. I write things down, not because I think they matter to history, but because writing them makes them real enough to carry. If I don't write a thing, it slips. It becomes something I dreamed. I didn't write anything that first afternoon. I was too afraid to move. I had come up over a limestone shelf about 400 yards east of a dry creek bed the locals called Cachillo Blanco. White knife, though no one agreed on why, and I had pulled my lame horse to a stop because the animal had spooked, and animals in that country who spooked at midday weren't spooked at nothing. Below me, in the shadow of a cut bank where the creek had once run deep and now ran only memory, there were 3 women. They were chained, not together, separately, each by one ankle to the iron wheel ring of an overturned supply wagon. The wagon had shed its cover. One wheel was up, one was buried in the soft creek silt that hadn't fully dried. The tongue pointed at the sky like a weather vane. I counted 3 chains before I counted 3 women. I want to be honest about that, about what I counted first. The women were sitting in various postures of exhaustion. 2 leaned against the wagon's belly. One had stretched flat in the shade, her arm over her face, her chest rising barely enough to confirm she was alive. All 3 wore what had been traveling dresses, gray and brown and dark blue, now so torn and dirt-caked that the colors barely registered. Their hair had come loose from whatever arrangements it had once been kept in. They were barefoot. Their ankles, where the chain cuffs bit, were raw enough that I could see the inflammation from where I crouched. I was still cataloging when I saw the warrior. He was not hiding. That was the first thing that struck me, and it struck hard because every story I'd ever heard about Comanche raiders described men who moved like smoke, who materialized and vanished, who were visible only when they chose to be and lethal because of it. This man was not hiding. He was sitting cross-legged on a flat boulder about 30 yards from the wagon, and he was watching the women. Not threatening them, not moving toward them. Just watching. He had a rifle across his knees, a good one. I could see the line of it, longer than a carbine. He had a blanket roll at his back and what looked like a water bag beside him, and he was as still as the rock he sat on. My horse made a sound. The warrior's head turned, not quickly, not with alarm. It turned the way a man turns when he hears something he already expected to hear, and he looked up at me on the limestone shelf with an expression I could not read at that distance, and he did not reach for the rifle. That was the second thing that struck me. I had my own rifle up. I'd pulled it before I was fully conscious of reaching for it, trained response, the same way you pull your hand back from heat. It was up, it was steady, and it was pointed at a man who was not pointing anything at me. There's a version of this story that ends there on the shelf, with a shot that echoes off the caprock and rattles back from the limestone and then goes quiet. I have thought about that version many times. I've wondered who I'd have been after that version. I don't think I'd have been anyone I'd want to share a fire with. I didn't shoot. I don't know why I didn't shoot. I could build you a reason. I can build reasons the way my old cartographer great-grandfather built coastlines, out of guesswork and professional confidence. But the honest truth is I hesitated because the man below me was not reaching for his rifle, and in the half-second that hesitation lasted, one of the women heard the horse. She sat up. She was the one in the dark blue dress, the one who'd had her arm across her face. She sat up and looked around with the particular frantic alertness of someone who has been sleeping in fear so long that waking feels like an ambush. She saw me on the shelf. She saw my rifle. And then, before she said a word to me, she turned and looked at the warrior on the rock. That look, I've carried it for 30 years, and I still don't have a word for it. It wasn't hope exactly. It wasn't trust, though it contained something like trust the way a creek contains water, in the sense that without the creek you wouldn't know there was water there at all. It was more complicated than hope. It was more complicated than anything I had language for in that moment. She turned back to me. "Don't shoot him," she said. Her voice was rough with dehydration and cracked on the second word, but it was steady. She said it the way you say something you've already decided on, not pleading, not demanding, stating. I kept the rifle up. "Who are you?" I called down. "Adeline Marsh," she said. "These are my sisters, Clara and Emmett. Emmett is short for Emmeline. Our wagon broke down 4 days ago. The men who were guiding us left us here." She said the last sentence like it was a fact she'd already made peace with, which told me something about Adeline Marsh before I ever came within 20 feet of her. "Left you chained," I said. "They chained us first," she paused, "and then they left." I looked at the warrior. He had not moved. "That man," I said, "is he." "He found us yesterday morning," Adeline said. "He hasn't hurt us. He brought water. She stopped. She looked at her sisters. The one I'd gather was Clara was awake now, watching me with the kind of focused attention that people develop when they've been afraid for a very long time, and attention is the only thing left they have control over. The third, Emmeline, hadn't moved. "He's been sitting there," Adeline finished. "He hasn't left." I didn't understand that. I don't think I was meant to, not yet. I came down off the shelf slowly, the rifle still up, watching the warrior on the rock. He watched me back. When I was level with the creek bed and about 50 yards out, I stopped. "You speak English?" I called to him. A pause, then some. His voice was lower than I expected. Not deep, exactly, more resonant. The kind of voice that sounds like it's always just finished saying something important. "Those women," I said, "did you do that, the chains?" Something moved across his face. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something more patient than anger and more dangerous. "No," he said. "Then what are you doing here?" He looked at the women, then back at me. "Waiting," he said. "For what?" He didn't answer that. He looked at the water bag beside him. Then he picked it up and held it out toward me, not toward himself, out toward me, as if I were the one who needed something. And I stood there like an idiot trying to recalculate a situation my whole life had told me I already understood. My name is Callum Pryor. I was 26 years old. I had ridden for 3 different outfits across the Texas Panhandle, and I had never once had a conversation with a Comanche man that didn't involve someone's horse or someone's gun or someone's blood. I put my rifle down. Not down as in I set it aside. Down as in I lowered it, held it at my side, kept it in my hand. There's a distinction, but lowering it was the thing. It was the thing that changed the afternoon. The warrior set the water bag back down beside him. He nodded, one small, precise movement, like he was acknowledging something settled. I walked the rest of the way to the wagon. Up close, the women were in worse shape than I'd gauged from the shelf. Adeline was the strongest. There was a kind of banked ferocity in her that had probably kept the other 2 functioning by sheer proximity. She was maybe 22, 23, dark-haired. A bruise along her jaw that had gone yellow-green at the edges, which meant it was several days old. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not exactly. They kept moving, tracking, assessing. They never fully stopped. Clara was younger, 17 maybe. She had her knees pulled to her chest, and she was watching me with an expression that was somewhere between terror and furious dignity. The particular look of someone who refuses to let you see how frightened they are and resents you for forcing the effort. She had a wool blanket across her shoulders that was not hers, not from any dress or bundle near the wagon. The warrior's blanket, I realized. He'd given her his blanket in August, in the Texas Panhandle. Emmeline Emmett, as Adeline called her, was the one I worried about most. She was the youngest, maybe 15, and she had gone somewhere inside herself that I recognized. I'd seen it in cattle after lightning. I'd seen it in men after certain battles. She was present in the technical sense. She was breathing, she was conscious, she could follow movement with her eyes. But she was very far away from the creek bed and the heat and the chain on her ankle. "How long has she been like that?" I asked Adeline quietly. "Since yesterday morning." Adeline watched her sister. "She was fine before that. She was the one keeping us talking, keeping us." She stopped. "There was a snake. It came through the creek bed and she screamed and it rattled and then it was gone, but after that she just stopped." She said it simply, without apology or explanation. Emmett had hit some internal wall and stopped, and they had kept moving without her because they had no choice, and Adeline Marsh had been carrying both sisters since. I said, "I need to get these chains off." "We need a key or a bolt saw," Adeline said. "The men took the key. The wagon has tools in the bed, but the bed is." She gestured at the overturned frame. I looked at the wagon. It would take 2 men to right it, or at minimum a lever system I didn't have material for. My horse was lame and would not carry 3 women regardless. I had water for myself, 2 canteens, and jerky enough for a day. I had a knife, a rifle, a pistol, ammunition, a field log, and approximately 20 miles of open country between me and anywhere that might be called help. I wrote that down later, that list. I write lists when I'm trying to not panic. It's a trick my mother taught me, and I've never fully outgrown it. I was looking at the overturned wagon and writing the list in my head when the warrior stood up. He crossed the 30 yards to the wagon without hurrying. He had a knife at his belt, long, bone-handled, and something else, a smaller tool that he produced from somewhere in his gear. He crouched at Emmeline's chain first. I took a step forward. He looked up at me, patient, waiting for me to decide something. I stepped back. He worked on the chain cuff at Emmeline's ankle for about 4 minutes. I timed it the way I time everything, by counting my own heartbeats, which is unreliable but all I have. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. His hands were careful. When the cuff opened, Emmeline made a sound, low, involuntary, like something releasing, and he sat back and waited until she'd processed whatever she needed to process before he moved to Clara. Adeline watched him with that complicated expression I still can't name. "He did this yesterday," she told me quietly. "He worked on the cuffs for an hour. He couldn't get them without the right tools. He left and came back this morning with whatever that is." "Where did he go?" I asked. "I don't know," she paused. "He signed to us before he left. I don't know the signs. I know he meant he was coming back because he left the water." I looked at the warrior's hands working the chain. I looked at the water bag where he'd set it on the rock. He left the water, I thought. He came back. He sat 30 yards away all night in open country where anyone could have seen him, watched anyone approach, done nothing to conceal himself, and waited. He was waiting for someone with the right tools. He was waiting because he couldn't free them alone. I've turned that over many times in the years since. The specific humility of it. The decision to stay in a place that was not safe for him, in plain sight, with a blanket on a girl he didn't know, waiting for help he had no guarantee would come, because leaving was not something he was willing to do. Clara's cuff came free. She pulled her ankle to her chest and wrapped her hands around it and didn't cry, which was its own kind of bravery. He moved to Adeline last. She watched him work. He worked. Neither of them spoke. When her cuff opened, she stood up immediately, before the circulation had even come back, and she stepped on her freed ankle wrong and would have fallen if she hadn't caught the wagon frame. She caught it, held on, waited, then let go and stood. The warrior stood too. They looked at each other for a moment that I wasn't meant to see, probably, but that I saw anyway because I was standing 6 feet away, and I'm a man who notices things, and then writes them down whether or not they were his to notice. Satepo, he said. He touched his chest. Adeline repeated it carefully, not quite right, but close. He nodded. Adeline, she said. He didn't try to repeat it. He just nodded again, that same precise single movement. I stood there with my rifle at my side and the afternoon burning off the caprock and the sound of the crows coming back to the cedar scrub 50 yards north, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the world I was living in. Not turn over, not break, shift. The way a wagon wheel finds a new rut and settles into it, and suddenly the whole vehicle is moving at a different angle. I didn't like the feeling exactly, but I didn't reach for the rifle either. The sun was already heading west when I started to take stock of what we had. 20 miles to water, a lame horse, 3 women with damaged ankles and 4 days of sun and terror behind them, a warrior whose presence would make any cavalry patrol shoot first and ask nothing, and whatever night was going to bring. I opened my field log. I wrote Cachillo Blanco, August, 3 sisters, a warrior who waited. I don't know yet what this means. That was the first page. There were many more to come. The creek bed was quiet as the light went orange. Clara had fallen asleep against the wagon's belly, Emmett beside her. Adeline sat apart, watching the country to the west. Satepo had climbed back to his rock. I sat between them all, which felt about right, and tried to figure out how I was going to get 4 people and a lame horse 20 miles across open caprock before anyone died. I had no good ideas. But for the first time in a long afternoon, I wasn't alone in not having them. We didn't move that night. I want to be clear about that decision, because I've second-guessed it 1,000 times and I second-guess it still. We had maybe 3 hours of good light left when the chains came off, and we had a lame horse, 2 women who could barely walk, one who was still somewhere far away inside herself, and 20 miles of caprock between us and anything. We stayed. I wrote it in the log, decision, stay until full dark has passed and Emmett is more present. Satepo knows the country, follow his read. That last sentence surprised me when I wrote it. I crossed it out. Then I wrote it again underneath. Satepo built no fire. He didn't gesture for one or suggest one or do anything that indicated he thought a fire was a good idea. And since a fire in that country at night is a signal visible from 7 miles in any direction, I took his no fire as tactical intelligence and didn't argue. I had hardtack and jerky. He had dried meat of a kind I didn't recognize. We distributed what we had between 5 people and nobody complained, which told me something about everyone present. Adeline ate quickly and efficiently, like a woman who'd long since stopped attaching any meaning to food beyond fuel. Clara picked at hers. Emmett took what Adeline put in her hands and ate it slowly, looking at nothing, and I counted that as progress. The dark came thick, no moon until past midnight. The stars were extraordinary. They always are out there, where there's nothing to compete with them. And I lay on my back for a while after the others had settled, looking up at that vast, indifferent arrangement and trying to locate myself within it, which is something I do when I'm afraid and can't afford to show it. The crows had gone quiet. The wind had dropped. The creek bed, for all it was dry, still held the faintest smell of old water and clay, and there was something almost restful about it if you could forget what the day had been. I heard movement. Soft, controlled, not the stumble of someone waking up to relieve themselves, deliberate, directional. Satepo moving north along the creek bed. I sat up. He turned. In the dark I could barely see him, just the shape of him, the way the starlight found the edge of his blanket roll. He'd taken his blanket back from Clara and given her my bedroll in exchange, which I only realized then and which I felt vaguely ashamed for not having done first. He made a gesture I couldn't read. I stood and followed him. We went about 200 yards north, where the creek bed curved and the cut bank got higher, and there was a lip of limestone overhead that made a kind of overhang. He stopped there and crouched. I crouched beside him. Below the overhang, half hidden by the bank's shadow, there were tracks. I'm not a tracker in any skilled sense. I can read cattle sign, and I can read horse sign, and I can tell you whether something was running or walking. That's most of what I have. Satepo put his hand flat near the tracks, not touching them, and I leaned in and looked and saw what he wanted me to see. Horse tracks, multiple horses, shod. Coming from the west, stopping, going back west. Recent enough that the edges of the prints hadn't crumbled. I felt my stomach drop in the specific way it drops when something bad has already happened somewhere nearby and is moving toward becoming something worse. "Army," I said. He shook his head. Then he hesitated, which I'd come to understand meant he was choosing between precision and simplicity in a language that wasn't his. "The men," he said finally. I stared at him. "The men from the wagon." He nodded. "They came back." Another nod. "When?" He held up 2 fingers, then pointed to where the moon would rise. 2 hours before moonrise. Maybe 4 hours ago. While we were still in the open creek bed, while I was cataloging water and hardtack and trying not to think too hard about what 20 miles of caprock was going to do to women with torn ankles. They'd come back and found the wagon empty and gone west again. I thought about that. Going west again meant they hadn't gone far, hadn't left the country, were possibly regrouping, possibly getting more men, possibly just waiting for daylight when tracking was easier. What I didn't know yet, what I was still naive enough not to fully grasp, was why they'd left the women chained in the first place, what they'd wanted that leaving accomplished. That part came later in pieces over the next several hours, in the way that Adeline Marsh told things. Obliquely, in the order she was ready for them, not the order that made narrative sense. I'll tell you now what I didn't know then, so the rest of this makes sense. The Marsh sisters weren't traveling alone by accident. They were traveling because they had to be. Their father had died 6 months prior, consumption, long anticipated, merciful in the end. He'd left them a piece of land near the Canadian River that they'd never seen, described in a deed their mother had kept folded in a Bible for 16 years. The men who had agreed to guide them, 3 of them, hired in Amarillo, had learned about the deed somewhere along the route. The land wasn't worth much in raw cash, but there was water on it, and in that country water was the thing that turned acreage into empire. Chaining them to the wagon in the caprock wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was waiting. They wanted the deed, which Adeline carried in an oilskin packet sewn into the hem of her blue dress. They'd taken everything else, the wagon's valuables, the horses, the cash, and they'd left the women there on the theory that 4 days of August heat would produce a cooperative sister, or 3 fewer problems. Satapo had found them on the 3rd day. I don't know exactly what his thinking was. I've assembled what I can from what he said, from what Adeline described, from my own observations over the 40-some hours I spent in his company. I believe, that he had been watching the wagon from higher ground before he came down. I think he spent time reading the situation. I think he saw what the chains were, understood what they meant, and made a decision that had nothing to do with nation or treaty or the long violence between his people and everyone else in that country. I think he just decided it was wrong. There's a version of this story that makes that simple. That wraps it in something clean about how human decency crosses cultural lines, and isn't that beautiful? I hate that version. It makes him into a symbol when he was a man. A specific man who made a specific choice in specific circumstances, and the choice cost him something, and I don't want the cost erased by the beauty of the gesture. What it cost him I'll get to. We went back to the others. I told Adeline about the tracks. She listened without visible reaction until I'd finished, and then she looked at her sisters sleeping against the wagon belly, and something moved across her face that she immediately pressed back down. "We need to move," she said, "before first light." "Your sisters' ankles." "They'll manage," she said it without question, not cruelly, factually, the way you say things when you've already accounted for the hard part and moved on to the logistics. "We need to go north," I said. "There's a ranch, the Calloway outfit, maybe 20 miles northeast. I know the hands there." "Can we trust them?" I thought about that longer than I should have. "Yes," I said finally. She looked at Satapo. "Will they shoot him on sight?" I thought about that too. "Probably yes," I said. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly that answer and had already been calculating around it. "Then we go north until we're close and he peels off," she said. She said we and he in the same breath, as if that arrangement was already decided, as if Satapo was already part of the plan. I looked at him. He was watching Adeline with an expression I'd started to be able to read a little, the particular stillness of a man following a conversation he can't fully parse, but understanding the shape of it. "She says north," I told him. 20 miles, a ranch." He looked at the country to the north, then back at me. "I know a way," he said. And that was how it was decided. Adeline woke Clara. Clara woke Emmett, gently, with her sister's name and a hand on her shoulder, the way you bring someone back from very far away. Emmett came back slower this time, but she came back more completely. She sat up and looked at the creek bed and looked at the overturned wagon and looked at Satepo standing 20 feet away, and something in her expression settled. "We're leaving," she said. "Yes," Adeline said. Emmett nodded. She stood up on her own. We moved out of the creek bed heading north in full dark an hour before any moon. I led the horse. Satepo led everything else, or didn't lead exactly. He moved slightly ahead and to the right, and we followed the negative space of where he wasn't, which amounted to the same thing. He moved through the dark caprock with a fluency that made me deeply, uncomplicatedly envious. Clara walked with her hand on my horse's neck. She didn't speak for the first 3 miles. When she finally did, it was to ask me how long I'd been riding for cattle, and when I told her, she asked whether I liked it, and when I said mostly, she said she'd never seen a cattle ranch and had always wondered what they smelled like. I told her, dust, manure, leather, and something underneath it all that was like grass and iron mixed together, which I'd never quite been able to describe before. She thought about that. "That sounds like work that matters," she said. Then she was quiet again, but she kept her hand on the horse's neck and her pace didn't falter. Emmett walked between Clara and Adeline. She wasn't speaking, but she was present in a way she hadn't been, and presence was enough. We made 6 miles in the dark before the moon came up. When the light arrived, the country changed. Everything that had been formless and manageable in darkness became open and exposed and very, very large. The caprock stretched north and west and east with the kind of completeness that makes a person feel both free and erased. I'd ridden it 100 times and it still did that to me. I could see in the new moonlight where Satepo chose his line. He stayed low when the ground offered it. He used the cedar scrub as cover when there was cedar. He read the land the way a man reads something he's been reading his whole life, automatically, below the level of thought. Around the 3rd hour, Emmett pulled up. I thought it was her ankle. I started to say something. "No," she said. She was looking west. "There." We all stopped. On the western horizon, maybe a mile and a half out, there was a light. Small, moving. The particular rhythmic bob of a lantern carried by a horse. More than one. I counted 3 lanterns, which meant at least 3 horses, possibly more if some riders were without lights. Satepo had already stopped. He was watching west with the same stillness he brought to everything. "They're not moving toward us," Adeline said quietly. "Not yet," I said. "They're quartering." "Looking. If we move, will they see us?" I thought about the moonlight. I thought about the open caprock. I thought about 6 people, 1 horse, and approximately 12 miles of open ground between us and anywhere. "If we run, yes," I said. "If we stay low and don't move, maybe not." Satepo turned and looked at me. Then he looked at the limestone that rose to our right, a low shelf, maybe 15 feet high, running north for a 1/4 mile before it curved east. He pointed. I understood. He wanted us under the shelf. We moved fast and low. The horse did not want to hurry, but I didn't give it the option. We got under the limestone shelf with what felt like no time to spare and settled in against the rock face. All 5 of us, in a line, while the lanterns quartered west in the moonlight and found nothing and moved south again. We waited 40 minutes by my counting. Then we moved north again. I want to tell you something about those 40 minutes. About what it was like to be pressed against a limestone shelf in the panhandle dark with 3 women I'd known for maybe 5 hours and a man I'd aimed a rifle at that morning. About the specific quality of shared fear and shared waiting. About how it levels things. How it doesn't care about the stories you came in carrying, the structures you'd built your understanding on, the distances you'd maintained between yourself and people you were taught were something other than what they turned out to be. Satepo was pressed against the rock 6 inches from my left arm. I could hear him breathe. He breathed the same way I did, measured, controlled, the breath of someone managing fear rather than not feeling it. I don't know why that surprised me. It shouldn't have, but it did. And the surprise of it did something to me that I spent years trying to properly describe and can only say now. It opened something up. Something that had been latched shut for a long time, quietly, without my ever quite noticing the latch. When we started moving again, I realized I'd stopped counting the distance between us. We made 9 miles before dawn started in the east. We stopped in a cedar break and rested. Emmett slept for an hour with her head on Clara's shoulder. I wrote 2 pages in the field log and then sat watching the eastern sky go orange and thought about the kind of country that could do all of this in a single day. Chains and cold water and lanterns quartering in moonlight and limestone and fear, and still come up beautiful in the morning. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't exactly. Dawn came in slow from the east, the way it does in flat country. Not a sunrise so much as a gradual brightening. The darkness going from black to purple to a deep bruised gray before anything you could call light arrived. I'd slept maybe 2 hours. I didn't feel it. We were in the cedar break, which was dense enough to break the sight lines in most directions and smelled of the particular dry resin that cedar gets in August, sharp and medicinal and slightly too strong. The horse was standing at the break's edge, head down, tail switching at flies. Clara had gathered enough dry grass to give it something to work on, which I hadn't asked her to do and which I noticed. Adeline had not slept at all. When I came fully awake, she was sitting with her back against a cedar trunk, her knees up, watching the country to the west through a gap in the branches. The oilskin packet was in her hands. She'd cut it loose from her hem while I was sleeping. She was turning it over and over between her palms, the way you handle something you're thinking about letting go of. I sat down beside her, not close enough to intrude. "Tell me about the land," I said. She looked at me, assessed something. Then, 140 acres. My father bought it sight unseen from a man who owed him a debt in 1858. He always meant to go look at it. He never did. The men who, is the water on it the reason? I think so. She looked at the packet. I don't know how they knew. We didn't tell anyone about the deed. But somehow, she stopped. It doesn't matter how they knew. What are you thinking about doing with it? She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father wanted us settled, stable. He spent his whole life worrying we'd have nothing after him. She turned the packet over. I don't know if 140 acres of Panhandle is stable. I don't know if it's anything, but it was what he had to give us, so. She stopped again. So we came, I finished in my head. Across 500 miles of difficult country with men they barely knew, because their father had given them a piece of paper, and they hadn't been willing to let it mean nothing. I looked at the oilskin in her hands. They'll keep coming for it, I said. Even if we get to the Calloway Ranch, even if we make it to town. The men from the wagon, they'll keep coming. I know. You could give it up, the deed, let them have the land. She looked at me with an expression that was very even and very still. No, she said. Not angrily, not defiantly, just no, the same way you'd say no to a question that had a clear answer. I nodded. Satepo came out of the cedar from the north side. He'd been scouting. He'd been scouting since before I woke, I realized. He'd never stopped. He made his way to where we were sitting and crouched nearby, and he looked at Adeline and then at the packet in her hands, and then he said something I had to ask him to repeat twice before I understood it. How far, he said, to the ranch? 11 miles, I said, maybe 12. He nodded, he was looking north. His jaw had a tightness I hadn't seen on him before. There's something, I said. South, he said. More men, they went south in the night. They'll cut north now in the day, try to run ahead. I absorbed that. They know where we're going. He looked at me. They know where you would go, he said. Everyone goes north. He was right. In that country with nowhere else, you went north or you died. They'd known it before we did. I stood up and looked at the cedar break. Looked at the horse. Looked at 3 women, Emmett fully awake now, sitting up, listening to this conversation with a focused attention that told me she'd come all the way back, that whatever had gone far away in her after the snake had returned. If they're cutting north to get ahead of us, I said slowly, then they're not watching the east. Satepo looked at me. Is there water east? I said. A pause, a long way, he said. But is there water? Another pause, yes. I looked at the horse. The horse looked at me in the unimpressed way horses look at people who are making things difficult. East, I said. We go east instead of north, find the water. Then cut north from further east, come to the Calloway land from a direction they won't expect. He thought about this. I could see him thinking, working the geography, working the risk, working whatever variables he had access to that I didn't. Longer, he said. But alive, I said. He looked at Adeline. She was already folding the oilskin packet and tucking it somewhere inside her dress. East, she said. He nodded. We broke from the cedar brake heading east as the sun fully crested. It was going to be a brutal day. I could feel the heat already building in the air, that peculiar dry weight of August on the caprock, and we were going to be moving through it for the next 6, 7, maybe 8 hours. I won't pretend those hours were anything other than hard. Clara's ankle had swollen overnight. She walked without complaint for the first 3 miles on it, and then the walking changed, subtle, almost invisible if you weren't watching, a slight hitch in her gait that she was working to keep out of her step. I saw it. Satepo saw it. He dropped back and walked alongside her without comment, and after another half-mile he simply took her arm over his shoulder and matched her step, and she let him, without ceremony, without making it mean anything larger than it was. Emmett walked ahead of them. I noticed she'd started doing something with her hands as she walked, a slight rhythm, fingers tapping against her thigh, irregular but consistent. A private counting. I recognized it because I do the same thing when I'm trying to keep my head where I need it, and I thought, she's been doing that all along, probably. This is what's kept her here. I kept the log in my mind's eye. I couldn't write while I was leading the horse, but I wrote it in my head. Emmett counts. Clara doesn't show pain. Adeline carries everything. Satepo walks beside the one who needs it without being asked. The water Satepo had mentioned was at a playa lake, a low bowl in the caprock that gathered rainwater and held it for months in good years. We found it in the early afternoon. It was brackish and smelled of algite and alkali, and it was the finest thing I'd tasted in recent memory. The horse went knee-deep in it. Nobody objected. We rested an hour. It was during that hour that the trouble caught up with us. Not the men from the wagon, something I hadn't accounted for. I heard hoofbeats from the north, not south, not west, north, and I had maybe 15 seconds between the hearing and the seeing. I used them to get the horse out of the water and get the women toward the playa's low eastern bank, which had reeds enough to break the sight line. Satepo was already behind a screen of scrub. 4 riders. Army. I felt relief, and then I felt the particular sick drop that comes when relief turns into something more complicated. 3 of the riders were blue-coated soldiers. The 4th was in civilian clothes, and even from 100 yards I could see he was talking, gesturing, pointing. I knew the type of gesture. I'd seen it before. The kind that says out there somewhere. They were tracking, and I understood then what Satepo had understood before I did, before I'd even known to think about it. They weren't tracking the wagon men. A Comanche warrior had been seen at Cachillo Blanco, or sign of one had been found, or a rumor had gone through the right fort, or someone had spotted his tracks and read them wrong. It didn't matter which. What mattered was 4 riders moving in a sweep pattern across the playa basin, and 1 Comanche man in a screen of scrub 30 yards to my left. If they found him, they would shoot him, or take him, and what happened after taking was something I wasn't going to think about clearly standing at the edge of a playa lake with heat coming off the caprock like something deliberate. Adeline appeared at my elbow. Army, I said quietly. I can see that. She looked at the riders, looked at the scrub where Satepo was. They're going to find him, I said. Yes. If I stand up, if I walk out there and flag them down, they'll come to me. I can keep them talking, long enough for him to move. She looked at me, and then I tell them about the wagon men, about you, about the chains. They'll take that as the priority. 3 women in distress is something they have to respond to. It gets him time. It tells them where we are, she said. Yes. And then the wagon men know where we are. The wagon men already know the general territory. The army finding us first changes the math. She was quiet for a moment. The riders had slowed. One of them was looking at the ground, the horse's tracks in the playa mud, probably. We had maybe 2 minutes. It's a risk, she said. Everything out here is a risk. She looked at the scrub again, back at me. Do it, she said. I handed her the reins. Then I stood up and walked toward the riders with my hands visible, and called out in the carrying way you learn from years of large, open country. What happened next was fast and slow in the way of most things that matter. They saw me. They turned. They came up and had rifles out within 30 seconds, and I kept my hands visible and talked. I talked about the wagon, about the chains, about 3 women, about the wagon men moving south and cutting north to intercept. All of it fast, in the most coherent order I could manage. The civilian was the one who registered it first. He had the look of someone hired to track, and I think he'd already started to recalculate the situation, because he looked at the ground around me, and then at the playa, and then at the reeds, and asked me how many people were in my party. I said 4, myself and 3 women. He looked at the ground again, at the tracks. He was good at his trade, he knew. He looked up at me, I met his eyes. He said nothing. He told the soldiers to come with him and turned south, not toward the reeds, not toward the scrub, south the way I'd said the wagon men had gone. The soldiers followed. The 4th rider, he was the last to turn, looked once at the reeds, looked once at me, and then he followed the rest. I have thought about that civilian tracker every year since. About what he read in the ground and what he chose not to say. About what calculation he ran in the time it took to look at the earth and then at me. About whether he did it for the women or out of some private accounting of what was just, or out of professional pride in reading a situation correctly, or just because he had better things to do. I've never been able to decide. When they were gone, I walked back to the reeds. Clara and Emmett were pressed low. Adeline still held the reins, very still, the horse quiet beside her. Satapo came out of the scrub. He looked at the direction the riders had gone, then at me. Something moved through his expression. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was more precise than gratitude. It was the specific acknowledgement of one person to another who has done something that cost them something, a recognition between equals. A debt created not in the financial sense, but in the sense that now something passed between us, a thread, and it would hold for as long as we were both alive to hold it. He nodded, that small, precise movement. I nodded back. We moved north again. The last 5 miles were the hardest. The heat peaked around 3 o'clock and turned the air into something oppressive enough to make every step a negotiation. Clara was limping openly now, Satapo still at her side. Emmett had gone quiet again, but differently than before. This was a purposeful quiet, conservation, not absence. Adeline walked in front with an expression so set and forward-looking that I stopped worrying about her, and started worrying about what she was going to do when we got where we were going. At the 4-mile mark, Satapo stopped. He looked north, then he turned and looked at Adeline. He said something in Comanche. He said it once clearly and then waited. None of us understood it. He thought for a moment, then in English, "From here straight north, 1 hour." He looked at me. "I know this line, you follow it." I understood. "You're not coming," I said. He looked at the northern horizon, back at me. "No." Adeline stepped forward. She had the oilskin packet in her hand. He looked at it at her. "I don't know what to," she started, and then stopped, because she was right. There was nothing in her hands or her language that was equal to what he'd done. And she knew it, and he knew it, and trying to put it in the oilskin packet or any packet was going to make it smaller rather than larger. She held the packet anyway. He looked at it for a moment, then he reached out carefully, deliberately, and put his hand over hers over the packet, not taking it, just covering it, 1 breath's worth, then he let go. "Keep it," he said. She closed her hand around it. He looked at Emmett. Emmett looked back at him. She was present. She was all the way here. She was 16 years old and 100 years old simultaneously in the way that experience sometimes makes you. And she said something I didn't expect. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." She didn't mean thank you for the water, or thank you for the tool and the chains, or thank you for walking 6 hours across the caprock and carrying my sister's arm over your shoulder. She meant thank you for not leaving, for choosing the first time and every subsequent time to stay. For sitting on a rock in plain sight in dangerous country with a blanket that was yours given to someone it wasn't, and waiting. He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded, one last time. He turned north, oriented himself by something I couldn't read, and then he turned west and walked back into the caprock without looking back. We watched him go. We watched until the distance and the heat shimmer made him indistinguishable from the rock and the scrub and the particular bronze light of late afternoon. And then he was gone the way things go in big country, gradually, incrementally, until you're not sure exactly when the going happened. I didn't write anything in the log. I just stood there. Then Adeline said, "North," and we went north. We reached the Calloway Ranch at dusk. The hands came out ready for trouble and settled into cautious assistance when they saw 3 women and a man with a lame horse and no immediate threat attached. I told them about the wagon men. 2 of them rode out before dark with a third who knew the territory. I sat on the bunkhouse step and finally opened the log. I wrote, "Made it. Calloway Ranch. All 4. I don't know what to call what happened out there. I don't know what it means that a man who had every reason not to stayed. I don't know what it means that I almost didn't let him. I don't know what it means that a tracker in Army employ looked at the ground and then looked at me and chose not to say what he knew. I don't know what it means, but it happened, all of it happened. I'm going to keep writing until I do." The wagon men were caught 2 days later, east of the Caprock, by a deputy and 2 Army riders working together in a way that rarely happened and maybe never happened before or after. The deed held. The land stood. The 3 Marsh sisters settled on 140 acres near the Canadian River and built what they built, which is its own long story and not mine to tell. I went back to cattle. I kept the log. I went back to Cochillo Blanco once about a year later, just to see. The wagon was still there, the frame, rusted now, 1 wheel up, 1 buried. The chain cuffs were still attached to the ring open the way he'd left them. I sat on the flat boulder where he'd sat. I tried to understand what it looks like from here. What he saw, what he calculated, what he decided, and how long it took to decide it.